Welcome back to World History by a Jew. We are doing the Bronze Age collapse in the Bible. And depending on how much you've read about antiquity, you may have never heard of the Bronze Age collapse, although I think all of you have heard of the Bible, but I'm going to put the two of them together. The Bronze Age collapse is one of the most interesting things to study in ancient history. It really, it's a lot of fun. So we're first define what it is and explain it to you a little bit. And then after that, we'll start talking about how this intersects with not only the lectures that we've been talking about, but in addition, we're going to talk about how it's going to talk about our future lectures, which are going to tie in more to the Bible. This is the first of a three-part series. All right, so our main lecture points, I want you to kind of see the direction we're heading tonight. I'm going to remind you of our key points in Exodus. And they're going to be familiar to those of you who saw the last two lectures, but I want to get that in the back of your head before we get started on the Bronze Age collapse. Then we're going to talk about the Bronze Age. I'm going to cover why it was such a high point in human history, and I'm going to talk about the superpowers of that time, give you a brief intro to each of those superpowers. Then I'm going to talk about the Bronze Age collapse. What is it? And we're going to go in through the causes of it. So this is the basics that you need to then, in your own mind, see how what we read about in the Bible intersects with what's going on in the rest of the world at this time. So I'm going to go into a lot of detail on the Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples are very relevant to what we read in the Bible, and they have a lasting impact on the land of Canaan. And I'm going to go back into Egypt. I know I said I'm leaving Egypt, but Egypt gives us our best story for dealing with the Sea People. So I want to talk about Egypt. And then I'm going to talk about what happened to the land of Canaan after the Bronze Age collapse. And the last section I want to get to is dating. So I want to get a little bit controversial. Those of you who are just starting on may have heard people try to argue that the Exodus was in the 1500s. And you can pick this pharaoh and that pharaoh. Those of you who have been with me for the previous lectures can already tell you why Exodus had to be in the 1200s. But that's only looking at the Egyptian point of view. When you then see what's going on in the land of Canaan, you have even further reason to understand that really the 1200s is the first time the Jews really could have been entering the land of Canaan. So our main mission over this series is the Bronze Age collapse. Is it in the Bible? How is it reflected in the Bible? There are three, and I've added a bonus fourth, key facts we need for dating the Exodus. And this again is review, but let me remind you, the Torah clearly states the Jews helped build the city of Pi-Ramses. Archaeology tells us Pi-Ramses only existed from about 1280 to 1060 BCE. So if the Jews helped build the city and it only existed for 220 years, then logic tells you that it must have been sometime towards the beginning of that 200 or so year period that the Jews were there to help build it. Now, then we have the Merneptah Stela, which we talked about a whole bunch last time. We talked about in the first Exodus lecture as well. And this tells us that there were people of Israel, but not a country, not a state, but a people of Israel in the land of Canaan around about 1208 BCE or slightly before. And then our final fact, which is not as strong as those other three, but deserves mention for dating purposes, is that Ramses the Great changed drastically, and Egypt changed after his 20th to 25th year, depending on where you want to date it. So that puts us about 1259 to 1254 BCE. So then in our last lecture, I was able to give you a very narrow range of our Exodus dates. So now I want you to just kind of have in your head that 1260 to 1245 BCE as we go through the lecture tonight and deal with the Bronze Age collapse. All right, so this is the end of the review. Now we're going to move on to the new stuff. This is the Bronze Age world around 1380 BCE. And these countries, are at least the ones around the Mediterranean here, are going to be critical to our story tonight. So first off, we have the Mycenaeans, which are the Greeks. I'm going to cover in more detail in a minute. The Hittites, we've got Matani, and then we have the Egyptians. All right, the others don't worry about for this evening, but I just want you to get your head around the map because we're focusing really on the Eastern Mediterranean tonight. And when you talk about the Bronze Age collapse, that's what we're talking about. So what I want to do is do a quick analysis of each of the superpowers before the Bronze Age collapse. So we're going to jump around a little bit. A lot of people like when I jump around, so you're going to see I do a good bit of jumping both in time and space tonight. So the Mycenaean Empire, this was the Greeks before they were Greeks. So before you had the Greek Empire, you had the Mycenaeans. Actually, before the Mycenaeans, there was also another precursor called the Minoans, but Minoans are long gone. Now the Mycenaean Empire is what's ruling Greece and the ancient. You can see all these islands here, all these islands in purple, shows you they're really spread out. By the way, for those of you who enjoyed my Ottoman series, here's a throwback for you. There's Naxos right there. So Naxos was also part of the Mycenaean Empire at this time. So the Mycenaeans brought a lot of this early Greek type knowledge, the engineering, the architecture, the military, and really what we would most identify as being the Greek gods. So a lot of the Greek gods got their beginnings here during the Mycenaean Empire, and then of course then Greece would take them, and then the Romans would take them. So I'm talking about Zeus and Venus and Aphrodite and these guys would all kind of, a lot of these major players would get their start here under the Mycenaean Empire. The Mycenaeans script has been deciphered. Its technical terminology is linear B, but it is, once you can read the script of a ancient people, you can learn a lot about them. So it has been deciphered, unlike the Minoans. Their first writing was a type of Greek. So for those who studied classical Greek, they were able to translate it into the Mycenaean language. So anyway, you see all these, the Mycenaeans had colonies all over the place, and also they traded all over the Mediterranean. We're going to talk a lot more about trading. One other thing before I move on. In each of these introductions, you're going to see I'm pulling my source of the Wikipedia article. I usually don't use Wikipedia as my source, but for this very general overview on each of these empires, I actually recommend the Wikipedia articles. I think if you want to know more than what I'm saying, then just look it up there, and they'll give you all you need to know for the basics. Now I want to look at the Hittites. Now the Mycenaeans I haven't really spoken about in my lecture series, but the Hittites I've spoken about a good deal. Most talked about one was probably with the first Exodus lecture, because I was talking about the Battle of Kadesh. And the Battle of Kadesh is when that pitted the forces of the Hittites against Egypt under Ramses II, and the two of them clashed in Kadesh here. The Hittite Empire covered at its peak most of modern Turkey and also Lebanon and some of Syria as well. So right here, I know it's a little bit off, but right here you see in the blue, this was from about 80 years before this map. So around 1380 BC, you see they really only had the eastern half of Turkey. They really expanded and had all of Turkey or almost all of Turkey and more by about 1300 or so BCE. And the Hittites, their language also has been deciphered. It's the oldest Indo-European language that's been deciphered. We have their cuneiform script. Now their capital here was Hattusa, which you can see right here on the map, and they branched out from there. So that's the Hittites. They also, by the way, had advanced metallurgy. And of these powers I'm mentioning tonight, I know I don't have it written on there, I should have, but their metallurgy is considered the most advanced. They seem to have developed iron tools earlier than any of these other great powers. And now here's the Matani Empire. Now the Matani Empire is a little bit more famous in my family than most people's families, because I have a son named Matan. But the Matani Empire has nothing to do with my son, nor is his name from them. But the Matani Empire was a northern Mesopotamian empire. They were centered around what's modern Syria. But it was rather short-lived, right? You're talking, it lasted from about 1500 to 1350 BCE. And its peak was around 1400 BCE. Now we're focusing more on 1175 to 1200 tonight. So they were well past their peak at the Bronze Age collapse, but they were still around. Now the Matani Empire, although short-lived, is very interesting. They had, I compare them to Prussia, really, that you have they have no natural borders. And when you have a successful country, even a short-lived one, a successful country with no natural borders, it means they're probably militaristic. And that's how since they don't have mountains or oceans to protect them, their military protects them. And so this is the Matani Empire, and this is why they expanded so quickly. They probably were part of a ruling class who were very similar to the Hyksos. So their weaponry was very similar to the Hyksos. If you want to know about the Hyksos, that's in the Abraham lecture. If you want to go back on my YouTube channel, I talk a lot about the Hyksos. But the Hyksos took over all of Egypt for a short period of time. And these people may have been the same, their weaponry was the same, they could have been from a related culture, but this minority group comes in and takes over most of what's now modern Syria and seems to rule the local population for a while. They would, though, end up getting shattered by the Hittites as the Hittite Empire gains power. Our next player for tonight, the Egyptian New Kingdom. And on YouTube, I speak about Egypt about 100 times more than whoever number 2 is on the list. But anyway, just to give you a real brief overview, I'm going to pretend you had never heard any of my lectures before. So the Egyptian New Kingdom was the golden age of Egyptian history. This was the 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties. The New Kingdom is considered to last from about 1500 to 1069 BC. So you've got a little over 400 years there of history. I'll mention a few like key pharaohs that that you should know if you haven't heard my other lectures. So first we have Thutmose III. Thutmose III is the one that I referred to as and by the way, he's in the Joseph lecture if you want to look back. But Thutmose III is the one I said was the Napoleon of pharaohs. He was the greatest military leader of all the pharaohs, and it was under him that the borders of Egypt expanded to its greatest extent. Then we had Amenhotep III. Amenhotep III is in King Tut Part 1, if you want to look it up. King Tut Part 1 talks about Amenhotep III because he's King Tut's grandfather. And under his reign, what made him interesting is many Egyptologists consider the greatest pharaoh ever, but he never fought a major conflict. He was successful through trade, diplomacy, strong economy. Just makes him stand out a little bit that he can be so great and not have to fight. And then we're talking about Ramses II, who was our pharaoh of the Exodus. I've talked a lot about him in the first Exodus lecture, but after we get through those first 20 years or so, he's like perfect stability. Everything was like smooth and steady until his death. So I call his reign the peak of stability in Egypt. We have a few prominent sites I wanted to point out here, right? We have Memphis and Thebes, the 2 ancient capitals, and then under Ramses, we had Pi-Ramses here, which is the city that the Jews built. So at the height of the Egyptian Empire, I will just mention they covered a lot of territories. This would be not just modern Egypt, but Sudan, Israel, Syria, Lebanon. If you want to know more about Egypt, I've got plenty of lectures on it. Just go to the YouTube channel. Okay, now I want to put all these guys together, and I want to use a couple examples of putting all these powers together. First is, what was being traded? I keep saying there's all this trade, and you got this great map here of the trade routes you can look at while I'm talking. But first and foremost was food, so grain and barley. Egypt was the breadbasket world for a long time, and Egypt was a breadbasket back in 1380 BCE, and it remained a breadbasket, right? The Romans too. I'm going to jump forward 1,500 years. The Roman Empire also still used Egypt as a breadbasket. So grain and barley. We have olives and olive oil. Everyone's well aware that comes from this part of the world. We had spices being traded, wine and grapes. We have other produce, almond, figs, pomegranates. The item archaeologists use more than anything else, though, is pottery. In fact, I'll mention Flinders Petrie, my favorite Egyptologist. Flinders Petrie was known for saying he never wanted to find gold. He hated it when he found gold. Why? Because then once gold's involved, you have to worry about the value and the money and all this. With pottery, pottery is not rich in value, but it's rich in information. So he loved finding pottery. With pottery, you can figure out where people are from. You can date people. You can watch the development. You can see the difference between whether there were people who were rich and people that were poor. You can see whether a society became more successful over time or less successful over time. Pottery tells a lot of stories, so it's very valuable to to Egypt, to archaeologists, so we should be very happy it was traded so much back then. Glass, both glass vessels and glass beads. Cloth and garments, right? We think of linen, like the Egyptians wore linen, or we can think of wool, like the Canaanites wore wool. This is the Bronze Age we're talking about, so I can't skip bronze. And bronze is made up of copper and tin. It's about 90% copper and 10% tin. Now, copper was pretty easy to find in the ancient world, but tin was not. So you had these great trade networks that were built just to find tin. So tin came from Afghanistan, and some believe tin came as far away as Ireland. And I know I'm talking about 1300 BCE. But it was hard to find tin, and it was very valuable. We needed to make bronze. Wood, from our very first lecture on Egypt, I talked about how the Egyptians, when they first created empire, had to trade with Byblos. Here's Byblos, and what's now modern Lebanon, to get the cedars of Lebanon. So our cedars of Lebanon were real, and they were an important trade item. And of course, you have luxury items, gold, silver, jewelry. And then for the more militaristic, weapons were being traded. So arrowheads and daggers and swords. And I'm going to talk about weapons technology in just a couple slides. So that's trade. Now I'm going to talk about diplomacy. So diplomacy, this is going to be a little bit of a repeat for those of you who saw my Amenhotep III lecture. That's King Tut Part 1. But I wanted to just mention a couple of these Amarna letters again. So the Amarna letters were this cache of letters. They were actually tablets, cuneiform tablets. So that's these you see in the background here, the wording. So these are clay tablets that have little tick marks in them called cuneiform. And there was this diplomatic archive that was discovered in Egypt, in El Amarna, which was Akhenaten's capital, or Akhetaten if you prefer to use that term. And it covers about 30 years of diplomacy. So from the end of Amenhotep III all the way through Akhenaten's reign and his short-lived successors, and then on to the beginning of King Tut's reign. So we have this, and you can see here the years, 1360 to 1330. So it's hitting us right in the middle of the 1300s. The tablets were written in Akkadian. That was the lingua franca at the time. So already at this point in human history, like English is today, if you want to be a first world power, first world success, you got to know English. A couple hundred years ago, it was French. So in their period of time, it was Akkadian. So we had the letters were from 6 major powers. And these powers would be Babylonia and Assyria, Mitanni, Hittites. These should be familiar to you. Al-Ashaya may not be, but that's modern Cyprus. So another name everyone knows. That a lot of it, these two I intentionally picked due to their connection to Israel and their naming cities anyone's going to recognize in Israel. This is World History by a Jew, by the way. But most of the letters were not like this. Most of them were vassal princes complaining about what their gifts are going to be, or whether they can get a bride, or this sort of thing. If you want to know more about these, like I said, you can go back to that older lecture. There's one other location I want to mention before we move on, and that's Ugarit. So Ugarit is right up here, and the Ugarit would be, near, it's like Syria, but near Lebanon in today's terms. But it was a city-state built on trade. It was very successful from about 1450 to 1200 BCE. They excelled at trade and diplomacy. And I put Venice here because it really was like this ancient Venice. So if you're into European history, then you'll know from the late Middle Ages up through the Renaissance, Venice was a power. Even though it's just this little city on the water, they built themselves a Mediterranean-based empire, and they were known for both trade and diplomacy. The best diplomatic corps at that point in European history was from Venice, and they traded all over the known world and became very wealthy doing so. But Venice would fall due to the Ottomans, and Ugarit was going to fall due to the Bronze Age collapse. I'm going to look at the map one more time. So here's our map. This is the known world in the 1300s, and now it's going to end. So it's 1177 BCE. It's the end of the world as these people know it, and this is the Bronze Age collapse. So I want to pull one quote to describe it. By the way, Dr. Drews wrote a great book, which I can give you the info if you want to read it, on the Bronze Age collapse. But he called this the worst disaster in ancient history, even more calamitous than the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD. So that's pretty heavy stuff right there. All right, so I just set up all these superpowers, this great trade, great diplomacy. You have the successful world. What's going to cause it to collapse? So let's look at that. There's no short, simple answer, but there are definitely a few major causes. So one is drought. And I want to look at a couple test sites. One is Cyprus and the other is Israel. Well, that was pretty convenient. So what archaeologists can do is take core samples. You see this more with ice than with soil, but you can do it with soil too. And what this is, you basically drill out this long tube of dirt or ice if you're doing an ice core. And each of those layers, through testing, chemical testing, you can find out a lot of information. So we have a couple cores I want to talk about, one in Cyprus and one in Israel. So in Cyprus, you have a core in the middle of a lake in the middle of Cyprus, and it shows that around 1200 BCE, the island's lush landscape began being transformed into an arid environment. It was actually one of the that core went back 5,000 years, and this is one of the driest periods of the 5,000 years that they tested. I also just mentioned the charcoal. I wanted to put that because back in pre-industrial times, charcoal was a sign of people building fires. So less charcoal in the air means there was less people building fires, which means that it was less populated. So you see a decrease of charcoal during this period of time, telling you either people moved or people were starving, but less people were there. In Israel, we're going to see a similar story. Samples taken from a deep core in a lake. This lake, though, is one we all know. It's Kinneret, right? In English, that's the Sea of Galilee. So in the Kinneret, they looked and they found that from about 1250 to 1100 BCE, Israel was suffering through a severe drought with a lot of native flora dying, and most specifically trees. Trees seem to be having more problems than anything else based on what they could tell from the pollen samples that they took. There was just less and less of the pollen from these trees there as time went on. So what does all this mean? I'm sitting here talking about core samples for World History by a Jew. Well, what I'm trying to say is that this is a drought situation. This means there's a food shortage. This means people are starving. And when people are starving, disease starts running rampant. There's a basic problem in this world. When people don't have bread to put on their table, bad things happen. And this gives us an indication that at this point in human history, all of a sudden that grain started to dry up. People didn't have bread to put on their table. So in that situation, people will either try to buy their way out of it, or they'll move somewhere where they can get it. And most people aren't in the economic position at this time where they can buy their way out of it, which means they're going to start moving. And people will do anything to feed their families, including move long distances. Let's look at another cause for the Bronze Age collapse: earthquakes. So, by the way, there is some debate still on this information I'm giving with the earthquakes. In general, let me just say that if you see this first source, you're going to see them on almost every slide tonight. I use Eric Klein, who's an expert on the Bronze Age collapse. I use him as my baseline. So if I see like some disagreement, I just use him as my tiebreaker. And he wrote a great book. It was actually a best-selling book on the Bronze Age collapse. So it's written here if you want to know more about it. All right, so there was a major earthquake that devastated the Mycenaeans about 1250 BCE. It destroyed a large portion of their capital, which their capital was Mycenae. Conveniently, that's what we call the Mycenaeans. Ugarit also had its similar destruction. So let me remind you, Mycenaeans are in what's now Greece, and Ugarit is in the Levant. So that's a huge distance of destruction. And it doesn't mean it was one giant earthquake. It could have been multiple earthquakes, but it's happening at the same time. In fact, there is a term for this. It's called an earthquake storm. So for about a 50-year period, much of the Eastern Mediterranean was getting hit with earthquakes. So the Mycenaeans were devastated. They had a horrible one around 1250, and then got hit by another major earthquake around 1190 BCE. And then look at Greece. So Greece, you had them, yes, first already said Mycenae, but also Thebes, Pylos, Cyprus got hit. Turkey, even the capital of the Hittites, Hattusa, was hit. Troy, which is a very famous name from antiquity. And then looking at the Levant and what's now modern Israel, Megiddo and Akko were hit as well. So what's the result? So the earthquakes, first of all, this is a Mediterranean society. So earthquakes mean on the sea means tidal waves. So these earthquakes are destroying port towns, they're destroying ports, they're destroying boats for people who live on the sea. It's very costly to rebuild. The governments will try to rebuild, the leadership will try to rebuild, but then that strains financial resources. City walls are tumbling down in earthquakes, which means now the most important mechanism for a city defensive mechanism no longer exists. And then when the ports are failing, when the ports are tumbling into the water, when the boats are destroyed, they can't take in food. So you have a famine and you can't grow food, and these earthquakes are making it much harder to import food. So you have more people who are starving because of this. So these people, again, it weakens the faith in their leadership, and they're going to go where they can feed their families. Now I'm going to talk about a technological change. We are in the Bronze Age, but the end of the Bronze Age, and what follows the Bronze Age is the Iron Age. So already towards the end of the Bronze Age, we see iron weapons. And iron existed before, but it was more of a, like the wealthy would have it. It'd be maybe if you had a really expensive axe, it could be the end of an axe. But what happened towards the end of the Bronze Age is more and more weapons started to be made out of iron than traditional bronze. And iron weapons were stronger than bronze. You also can they're more flexible. So you can make a longer sword. So you have an offensive weapon that's better than ever before. And you can also do other things like metal greaves. So now your defensive weapon is better than ever before. And new fighting techniques are developed. So what happens is if you have people wielding iron weapons and they move as mass skirmishers, it changes the battle. That's not the way people would traditionally fight. And I wanted to point out this one sentence because this is important. It can actually help empires fall. Iron tip javelins, I should say, were strong enough that you could kill a horse with a throw. And think about chariots. So this is really where we're going to see this era of the Bronze Age collapse, where iron came from being for the token few, the wealthy few, to the weapons of the masses. So what's the result? Well, the empires are very slow to adapt. First of all, they're huge, right? How are you going to spread this technology over your entire empire, particularly at that point in human history? It was difficult. Next, the empires have other issues, right? They're trying to feed their people. They're trying to rebuild their cities and their boats after earthquakes. They have other things going on, and then to take their huge empires or huge armies and start upgrading them from bronze to iron, it's an expensive endeavor. So all of a sudden you have if you do have an army come up, and they do, an army come up that has this massed infantry with iron weapons, they suddenly can start beating these large imperial armies for the first time. The chariots, and I said I was going to come back to this sentence, the chariots now are going to have a problem because these horses that lead the chariots, whereas the chariot used to be like this tank, and it would still live a long life, but it loses its advantage when suddenly you have a javelin, like you may see a missile today that can take out a tank. Suddenly these javelins can take out the horses. And what I'm saying is the imperial armies lost their edge. The imperial armies couldn't defend their people like they could before, and the people no longer had their city walls in many cases to fall back on. I wanted to mention a couple of quotes here. One's in Joshua and one's in Judges. In the books of Joshua and Judges, you see iron chariots referred to for the first time, and it's used in the context that it was very difficult for the Israelites to face an army with iron chariots. In fact, often they couldn't defeat them at all. And now let me just say, there were no iron chariots. All right, that's a figure of speech. Most experts would say that it was more of a phrase, like iron chariots just means they have an army that's armed with iron weapons. But clearly we see from our biblical text that iron was changing the scene in battle. It was changing the strategy. And those armed with bronze weapons, as is recorded in our scripture, had a lot of trouble facing down armies that had iron weapons. Cause number 4. There's 5 causes, by the way, so we're almost done with this list. But number 4, let's talk about the cultural changes. So trade is great, and I love that they have this international trade, right? That the world is kind of flat. for at least in the Eastern Mediterranean, but the powers became dependent on each other. So Egypt's a great example. The Egyptian grain was probably feeding a lot of the Eastern Mediterranean. So if there's a problem with the Egyptian grain supply, then that could mean people in Turkey are starving because of what's going on in Egypt. It means there's a weakness. So the failure of one dependent resource could have a domino effect on other powers. There's also weaker leadership now. The great generation of leaders are gone. And I'm not to say everyone has and every single town is a bad leader, but really these great names from history, Ramses the Great and Amenhotep III and Thutmose III, these guys are gone now. And what happened is when they had long, stable reigns, their government expanded. So the bureaucracy has increased, but you don't have this great leader at the top. And they have no Joseph. They have no Joseph. So there's a lack of preparing for a rainy day. No one's storing 7 years of grain in Egypt. And there's other theories. I'm not going to go through all of them, but soil degradation, overpopulation, peasant revolts, mercenaries, all these mercenaries, for example, just to explain one, it means it's much more expensive to maintain an army because you're now paying for mercenaries instead of using conscripts. And then on top of that, they're less loyal to your people. So anyway, I don't want to go through each one of those, but just give me an idea. All right, so a quick analysis before we go to the next slide. We have drought, major drought for a long time. People are starving and they have to find food. They will do anything to feed their family, including resort to violence. We have earthquakes, which means city walls, defenses are weaker. We have an economic strain to rebuild, and it affects the distribution of food and other basic necessities. Technology is changing, so smaller armies with iron weapons can suddenly defeat larger armies, the same time that because of the food issue, these powers can't afford to rearm like they did before. And then we have this interconnected trade that if one domino were to fall, it can impact others. And then finally, we have bad leadership. The great leaders are gone, and they're replaced by a slow-moving bureaucracy. So this is our situation. Nothing looks great. We're at the edge of the cliff, and then enter the Sea Peoples. So the Sea Peoples are going to be that final straw that broke the camel's back. And there are some that think really the entire Bronze Age collapse are really just the Sea Peoples. I believe that there were other extenuating circumstances, but we're going to spend a little bit of time on the Sea Peoples now. All right, so the invasion of the Sea Peoples. So who were the Sea Peoples? They were a confederation of mostly seafaring people. There's 9 distinct names that we know, okay? Now their origins are disputed. Each of those 9 people come from different places or mostly different places. But in general, you're talking about somewhere in the neighborhood of the Mediterranean. So here's a list. You can just look down the list to see. I'm going to break down, not tonight, but in the next lecture, some of the individual Sea people. But I will mention one. This is when the Philistines arrive. So the Philistines are a major, major player in Jewish history. And that's where, of course, we get the term Palestinians today. So when did the Philistines / Palestinians arrive? It was through these Sea Peoples during the Bronze Age collapse. So that's kind of going to be your cliffhanger. I'm going to talk about them next time. Now, they wreaked havoc all over the Mediterranean. You can see here the modern version of the countries they attacked would be modern Egypt, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, Cyprus, Sicily, Greece. They wreaked havoc all over. They had a navy, although it was mainly troop transport ships, which I'll get back to. You can compare them to pirates. You can compare them to Vikings. They also served as mercenaries on both sides of the battle. We're going to talk about one of those specifically a little bit later. The earliest record of the Sea Peoples goes back to Akhenaten. So this would be mid-1300s. And they're actually going to be important, not so much for tonight, but for the last lecture. Now, the peak of the invasions was from about 1215 to 1175 BCE, which means they were facing off against Merneptah, who I talked about a lot in the last lecture, and then also his successor, well, a few steps down, but after a few short-lived successors, his next long-lived successor was Ramses III. All right, so what's the result of this invasion of the Sea Peoples? So we have a collapse of the great powers. We're going to see that the Mycenaeans are wiped out. The Hittites are wiped out. Matani's already weak anyway, but Matani's also wiped out. Egypt's power is going to be permanently reduced. Egypt will never be a great power again after the Bronze Age collapse. We have destruction of many, many cities and city-states. This is only a very, very partial list. But we have Ugarit was gone. That's the one I told you was like Venice. Kadesh, the site of our great battle in the Exodus lecture, gone. Aleppo in Syria, poor Aleppo is gone today too, but destroyed back then. Troy of the Iliad, Troy gone. Hattusa, capital of the Hittites, gone. Thebes and Mycenae in Greece. So this is just the Aegean Levant. And then let's look at what's going on here in the land of Canaan. Ashdod, Ashkelon. Ashkelon was like one of our star cities. We talked a lot about Ashkelon in the last lecture. Gone. Akko, which is very close to where my wife grew up. Akko, gone. Hazor and Megiddo and so on and so forth. I'm just emphasizing how much destruction there was. But all these names should be familiar to you. These are all biblical locations. And we're going to talk about some of these in detail. So several of these sea people will settle in the land of Canaan. The Philistines being the most famous, but the Philistines aren't the end of the list. So we're going to come back and I'll talk about these people and how they're reflected in the Bible, not by the same name, but they're there. And finally, I want to give you one more shot to look at this map. So this is the same map that was on the upper left here, but this shows you the destruction sites. So you can see, and by the way, this actually isn't every single one. There's a lot, but these will be the significant destruction sites from the sea peoples. So why do I keep harking back to this? Because the sea peoples are the major link between the Bronze Age collapse and the Bible. It's the impact of these sea people and them settling in the land of Canaan that's going to lead to our what we read about when the Israelites come to the land of Canaan and go to conquer it and form the first Jewish state. Okay, so I'm going to stop us here for this evening. I'm going to open the floor for questions.